Today's guest is Akhil Reed Amar, who is a sterling professor of law and political science at Yale University and author of several books on constitutional law and history, including America's Constitution, a biography, and America's Unwritten Constitution. We are going to be exploring his book that was published in 2021 called The Words That Made Us. As it's planned, this is part of a 3-book series. This book really focuses on when the Constitution was established. It actually takes a look before that and gives us some context about what actually led to the development of our Constitution and really what these words mean from a legal framework and a legal point of view. So at this particular point in time, I would love to introduce Akhil to our show.
Thank you very much. I'm well. I'm very grateful to be here with you all and with an extraordinary audience. So thank all of you for spending your Sunday with us.
Hey, fantastic. Before we actually begin, one of the things that I think is great about what we do is that we have a student question of the week. This is a chance for middle and high school students to win a $50 gift certificate for use in the Gilder Lehrman gift shop. You can buy books, you can buy t-shirts. There's some cool drag that you can, adorn yourself with. And so you have the opportunity to do that if you submit a question for the historian, which will be featured. And the winning question is going to be announced and asked here. You and your teacher will win a $50 gift certificate. And so we actually do want to start with our student question. This question comes from Amita Greenwald, who is a 12th grader from the Quarry Lane School in California. And the question is, to what extent is the purpose of the US Constitution mass communication? Especially when considering that certain groups of people in terms of race and gender had been initially excluded from the document?
Brilliant question. Whether it's the purpose of the Constitution, I think you could say it is. The purpose of the Constitution is to keep us talking to each other. And I will say, whether it's the purpose, it's the basis for the Constitution. You can't have a Constitution without conversation. And the question actually was very sophisticated. It wasn't just about communication, but about mass communication. So one of the big themes of this book is how important American newspaper culture was early on. My claim is America's written constitutions emerge organically, state and federal, organically with a robust newspaper culture in America. By 1790, America has more per capita newspaper readers than any place in the history of the world. And the constitutions, the state ones first in 1776, the federal one in 1797, they're short precisely so that they can be republished, start to finish, in newspapers read by ordinary people up and down the continent. Ordinary people are participating in a conversation with each other through newspapers about whether they should say yes to the Constitution or no, we do, we don't. These early newspapers actually were a little bit closer, interestingly, to kind of social media culture today. They didn't pay a lot of staffers to do serious investigative stuff. They're basically retweeting official pronouncements, grand jury reports, legislative speeches, judicial opinions, and people are just sending in stuff, just like this questioner sent in a question for free, and the reward is basically you get published, just like the reward of that questioner is they got their question asked. So yes, you can't have a constitution without, or at least American style, voting, and you can't have voting without conversation, without deliberation, without robust, uninhibited, wide open free speech, mass communication. Absolutely. Brilliant question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that response. And I also appreciate the way that you framed it around, oh, this is Twitter conversation. And, it's a different method of how we, communicate today. Speaking of which, I think the first question that I have is really around the framing for your project, right? Um, and on page Roman numeral X of your preface, you mentioned that in recent decades, many great historians have turned away from institutional and political history and towards social history, exploring the daily lives of our common folk more than the deep logic of our common law or the basic features of our constitutional government. I guess I'm curious why you positioned kind of the former and the latter against each other, and why you understand kind of the context through which historians are operating in that framework today.
I applaud social history. Some of our greatest historians do it. But if I'm going to tell you about the Constitution, I'm going to have to tell you about laws and government and institutions. And that's inescapably going to be a little bit more traditionalist in certain ways. I'm going to tell you about lawyers and senators and presidents and representatives. And because actually the Constitution turns out to be very much about making sure that we don't lose the next war of independence against the Brits or the Spanish or the French or the Russians. It's going to be about generals as well and diplomats. So, but here's the thing. If I were in Britain and I just told you about the great, persons, there's a famous guy named Carlyle who talked about the great man theory of history or something. So if I'm in Europe, I'm telling you about the generals, Napoleon, or the kings, and that's actually not a popular story. But in America, even if I'm telling you about the presidents and the generals and the diplomats, because actually they're picked in a democratic process through voting, I'm actually telling you, in effect, a story also about ordinary Americans. Whom are ordinary Americans actually picking? And it is pretty stunning that some of these people who are leaders, they're not born that way. In Britain, I can tell you just on the day of his birth, oh, there's this guy, his name is Charles, and one day he's going to be king or something. Well, we don't know that in America. Who would guess that a low-born person like Alexander Hamilton on the day of his birth would actually end up, being a $10 founding father, or Benjamin Franklin, a guy who's one of 16 children. His father's a candle maker. He's the product of a second marriage. Andrew Jackson, pretty low born. Later in my story, Abraham Lincoln. So even when I'm telling you stories about the famous people, Hamilton, Franklin, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, I'm also, in effect, in America, telling you a story about ordinary people, because ordinary people decide to a much greater extent than in Europe or Britain, who actually is going to lead us. Because in those places, it's military people by force of arms, Napoleon, or people who are just to the manner born, divine right of kings, George III, or today, that would be Queen Elizabeth celebrating her 70th, whatever, or Prince Charles, who's one day going to be King Charles.
Gotcha. Thank you. I guess, like, even, in that context, I wonder if you feel that social historians are not doing legal history justice in their articulation.
Well, they're great. We need them, and it's a useful corrective. But sometimes even, I don't just do legal history, I'm doing constitutional history. So legal history might be, for example, the law of marriage. Oh, and it matters. Well, what do women think of marriage? There are rules of coverture that actually give men all sorts of power to control their wives' property, even their bodies, their sexual reproductive organs, and all the rest. So there's so much law. Adoption law, family law is. Of course, we need social history to do that. What does it feel like to be a wife or a child. But if I'm doing not just legal history, but constitutional history, necessarily that, and I just, I wanted just to be, upfront about that. I'm going to be talking more than maybe some other folks about the House of Representatives and the Senate and the Supreme Court and the presidency and the cabinet.
Sure, thank you. So I think speaking of that, you talked about some quote ordinary like folks in the context of the development of United States history that became something. And one of the people that you focus on in chapter 1, who I actually knew very little about, is James Otis, senior and junior, but more so about Otis Jr. And I'm curious because you highlight a really, I think, specific situation that I think might often get overlooked in the historical discourse about kind of the causes of the American Revolution, and that's around the writs of assistance. And I'm curious to know, like, what do we need to take away from that particular story, set of circumstances? How do we need to shift the way that we think about the American Revolution because of that?
So I stumbled across this guy named James Otis, and I'd seen the name before. And I read intellectual historians, but I actually had no picture of who he was, or really what it was all about. And I came to realize, oh my God, this is a really interesting character. I can tell a really interesting story about him. And there are about 10 or 15 things that are important here. So later, he is a rabble rouser. He's a rabble rousing lawyer. Everyone knows about Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death. If this be treason, make the most of it. Almost no one knows about James Otis. He's the Massachusetts counterpart and precursor of the rabble rousing Patrick Henry. What's so cool about him? Here are a few things. One, he's going to be the early leader of the American Patriot cause against the Stamp Act, against which is 1764-65. And since the first question was about mass communication, everyone knows about no taxation without representation. Actually, James Otis came up with that phrase. He's the American popularizer of that phrase, no taxation without representation. But why else was the Stamp Act bad? It was in effect a tax on newspapers. And who's not going to like that? The newspapers themselves. So they push back on it really hard. So like, don't pick a fight with the media, Okay, but James Otis is by 1764-65, he's the leading American voice against the Stamp Act. He actually helps organize a thing called the Stamp Act Congress, which will be the first organized continental resistance to Britain up and down the continent. And it's James Otis, and I didn't know who this guy was. So that's interesting. So no taxation without representation. That's interesting. He's a rabble rouser. That's interesting. Oh, it's a Boston story and not a Virginia story. That's interesting. But here's another thing that I didn't know about James Otis. James Otis writes the first major pamphlet against the Brits in 1764. And in that pamphlet, he says, slavery is wrong. Wow. Okay. He says, as he starts to think about how he is being mistreated from his point of view by the Brits, he starts to think, well, maybe we're mistreating other people. Now, you don't get that at that early stage in Virginia or in South Carolina. But I thought, wow, this is interesting. And it's a Boston story. I came to see that the early moments of the American Revolution really are Boston based in a way that I didn't before. And James Otis was there before anyone else. And his story got forgotten in part because the leaders of the American Revolution later on will become the famous Virginians. 8 of the first 9 presidential elections are going to be won by a Virginian. Washington twice, Jefferson twice, Madison twice, Monroe twice. And they kind of erase, to some extent, the Boston story, which John Adams wants to revive because he was in the room when James Otis was rabble rousing and he looked up to James Otis. It's also a couple of other things. He's a lawyer and I'm a lawyer. And so I actually kind of know how he talks. And he actually comes up with a theory that Parliament is bound by higher law principles, which is going to later lead to an idea of a written constitution restricting government. And finally, what was really cool, two final things. He's saying all of this, James Otis rabble rousing, before almost any other American historian starts the story. They all say, oh, the story of the American Revolution really begins at the end of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, when Parliament starts to tax Americans. But oh no, he's complaining in 1760-61, not 1763. Almost every other, but historians talk about periodization. Almost every periodization of the American Revolution is 1763 to 1776. I'm seeing it earlier, and and in part, it's because the Bostonians are beginning to see that they don't need the Brits anymore. The Brits have just basically defeated the French in Canada, and it's like a 17-year-old kid who says, I don't need mom and dad anymore. Please give me the keys to the car, toodles. The Brits haven't really begun to misbehave, but the Americans are beginning to say, oh, maybe we don't need the Brits anymore. And in this little vignette, so I'm telling the story earlier than anyone else. I'm bringing in a national security dynamic, but I also have one other amazing character in the room. I've got John Adams, little fly on the wall, 25 years old, taking notes. No one's heard of him before, but he thinks this is interesting, and he publishes the story about it many years later. I've also got the most eminent American-born loyalist, a person who in 1776 is going to stay loyal to King George III, and he's a decent guy. And again, my audience hasn't heard of him. I didn't know very much about Thomas Hutchinson, but he's in the room with James Otis, with John Adams, and their legal arguments and rabble-rousing arguments, and eventually anti-slavery arguments, and all sorts of ideas about limiting Parliament and no taxation representation, and the importance of a constitution governing Parliament, and geostrategic and military things in the background. I thought, oh my God, I've got a really great story that I didn't know before, that almost no other reader, and I've got good characters. Now, unfortunately, they're three white men, but, oh, James Otis has a sister. Her name is Mercy Otis Warren, and she's one of the early, actually, historians of the American Revolution. So I bring her a little bit into the saga a little bit. Oh, I got John Adams there. Later, I'm going to bring Abigail into the story a bit. I'm trying, truthfully, to bring some of the women in at the margins, but the truth is, in the big public events, they, to some extent in this period, still are at the margins. They're not voting yet. They're not publishing all sorts of pamphlets in their own name. They're not giving the great speeches yet. They will. Volume 2, oh, just you wait. That's going to be 1840 to 1920. Women and African Americans and African American women are going to come center stage. And the drama is in part going to be, oh, they weren't there at the center of the stage quite early on, but they are now. But James Otis is saying slavery is wrong before almost anyone else in America. And oh, that's cool.
Yeah. So with that, do you think James Otis is going to get his own musical?
He is a bit of a crazy man. He actually goes insane. He has some really interesting similarities to George III in this respect. I actually find him a little bit annoying, even though I find him interesting also. I do love Hamilton. The book is dedicated to several folks, including Ron Chernow, who writes a great biography of Hamilton, Lynn Miranda, who, is Lynn Miranda, his spouse, Vanessa Nadal. So deep down, if I have to pick, my rankings, Washington ranks very high, Hamilton ranks very high, Otis a little less so, because he kind of fades out when he goes crazy. He doesn't make it, as a practical matter, till 1776. But yeah, I think his story deserves more attention than it's gotten. And it was really fun to discover Otis, because we have a very sophisticated audience. And I bet most of them don't know anything about James Otis or anything about Thomas Hutchinson, who are two of my three.
Yeah.
And the other is John Adams, who writes the story down.
Thank you for sharing that and for providing that context. I do want to shift gears a bit and think about your work in conversation with some historians. And so a historian that, I've been studying and exploring and introducing to my students is Paul Ortiz. He wrote a book called An African American and Latinx History of the United States. And one of the things that he shares in that book, and I quote, he says, "It's not surprising that a war of independence became a war to preserve slavery. And he references kind of a landmark court case, the Somerset versus Stewart case in 1772, which basically says that the outcome of this common law case, potentially poses a threat to the hegemony of slavery in the United States as an institution that's been preserved, something that you name as a contradiction. One of the things that I wanted to ask in relation to this, right? So Paulerty says that this case was interpreted by many white leaders in the 13 colonies as foretelling the doom of slavery in the British Empire. And I'm wondering how your work speaks to that claim or not.
It speaks directly, and in fact, I have extra notes that I've got 100 pages of endnotes. It's a 600-page book, 100 pages of endnotes, but then I've got another 100 pages of additional materials on a free website that's keyed to the pages of the book itself, where I talk a little bit more about this particular claim. I'm a little doubtful of it. It's connected very much to Hannah Nicole Jones is one of her central claims in the 1619 project, and a thing called Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. It's been very controversial. Gordon Wood and Sean Willents, Jack Raycove, Jim McPherson, very prominent historians have raised some questions about it. I'll tell your audience a little bit more about it in just a minute. So, so I talk about it a lot. I think that the Constitution ends up being pro-slavery, but the Declaration of Independence, because 3/5 is a huge, huge bonus for the South. And it's not just in the House of Representatives, but the Electoral College. So because of the 3/5 clause in the Constitution, which is, remember, a little bit later in my story, 1787, almost all the early presidents are slaveholders or Southern slaveholders or Northerners who play footsie with slavery, who accommodate it in various ways, because you can't get elected otherwise. Thomas Jefferson, yeah, he beats John Adams in 1800, 1801, but without the extra electoral votes created by Southern slavery, 3/5 clause, Adams actually would have won. So I am very much a neo-Garrisonian in believing that the American Constitution structurally is leaning toward slavery. There's no openly anti-slavery president. The president says slavery is wrong and we should eventually get rid of it. No president says that until Abraham Lincoln. No cabinet officer says that till Abraham Lincoln, and that's all the 3/5, okay? But I don't believe that the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence were similarly pro-slavery. And I don't believe that because I think your teacher may have overread Somerset's case and the American response to it. So here's what I want to say, and I'm going to vote my parents, who are still alive. My dad's in his 90s, my mom's in her late 80s. They are born in undivided India under the British rule, the British Raj. And let me tell you, that story that you've been taught is way too nice to the British. The British were not on the verge of getting rid of slavery. They didn't get rid of slavery until 1833. So and I'm saying this because they were horrible in India. And I know this is like personal story, my family. So it's not true, in my view, that the Brits were good on slavery. The Americans are complicated on slavery. And that's why Otis is important. Here's what I believe. Massachusetts is early on anti-slavery. And in fact, by 1780, will adopt a constitution inspired by James Otis, abolishing slavery. And by 1783, Massachusetts courts are going to so hold, in the case is called Quack Walker, Holmes versus Jennison. So slavery gets abolished in the North at the time of the American Revolution. The world's first anti-slavery society in the history of the world is founded in Philadelphia in 1775, and its later presidents are going to be people who signed the Declaration, like Benjamin Franklin and Benjamin Rush, and Pennsylvania will get rid of slavery in its constitution, in a statute in 1780, gradually, but okay, big step back. Almost every society in the history of the world has had forms of unfreedom. The Aztecs, the Incas, the Mayas, the ancient, the biblical world, China, forms of unfreedom, Native Americans. There's always been slavery in the world. It's the ancient Greeks, Romans, almost everywhere, almost all times, forms of unfreedom. There was an idea of freeing individual slaves, emancipation, manumission. That's what Ben-Hur is all about, with Charlton Heston, he gets his freedom. That's what A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum is all about with the Zero Mostel character. He's a slave conniving for his freedom. So there was an idea of freeing individual slaves. But before the American Revolution, nowhere in the world was there this profound idea of ending slavery, abolition, not emancipation, manumission, abolition, the idea of ending slavery everywhere. That's actually an American idea first. The world's first abolition society is formed in 1775 in Philadelphia. The Brits aren't going to eventually get rid of slavery in their system until 1833. Americans not until the 1860s. So here's my claim in a nutshell. America isn't one thing, it's several things. The North is increasingly anti-slavery, and the American Revolution accelerates that, led by people like Otis. And so they're going to get rid of slavery. Deep South actually is doubling down on slavery, South Carolina. These are two kind of and in the middle, you got places like Virginia, which are a little confused. Slave regimes dominated by people who really don't love slavery, deep down. They all have to ally with each other, Massachusetts and New York and Pennsylvania and Virginia and South Carolina, because if they don't form an alliance, the Brits will slice and dice and kill them. So they actually come together, but they are deeply at odds with each other. And after the American Revolution, the Constitution, they're going to start to break apart. Analogy, and then this is a great question. To beat Herr Hitler in the 1940s, Americans ally with Joe Stalin, who's actually, a tyrannical authoritarian thug, in my view. But we have to make an alliance with him to beat Hitler. And then after the war, America and the Soviet Union actually start to pull in different directions because they're very different societies. My analogy, the North and the Deep South have very different understandings of things. The American Revolution will actually accelerate abolition and create abolition in the North, but will actually allow South Carolina in some ways to be even worse than it was before. And that's going to put us on the road to the Civil War. But the Brits do not think the Brits were good on this. Somerset's case said no slavery in Britain, but it doesn't get rid of slavery in the West Indies and in Jamaica, all the rest. And it's even worse of West Indian slavery than South Carolinian slavery. The Brits aren't going to get rid of slavery until 1833. But when they do, in 1833, which is the end of my book, these guys who start up being behind the Americans were ahead of them on abolition. And now by the end of the book, the Brits are doing better on abolition. And many Americans deep down are ashamed by that because we were supposed to be the light unto the world. And now, and we were ahead on abolition in 1775 and 1780, and now we're falling behind. So that's the complicated story I tell.
Thank you for that. And I think this question is also related. Several years ago, you had a conversation with Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. And when you started that conversation, you asked him, like, essentially, who is this we in the United States? I see there's lots of questions that are coming in to the Q&A that are, really discussing some of these ideas around identity and inclusion, in the context of the United States. You started off with Justice Thomas with that question. You have a chapter in your book that's dedicated to this notion of we. And I'm curious to know, like, in short, how you would articulate that idea and how that is something that has shifted over time.
So the audience can see this on C-SPAN. It's an event I did at the National Archives. And I'd gone to the National Archives when I was 10 years old and gotten a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation that my parents, I'm from California, brought with me. And that's actually what inspired me to do constitutional law. So the National Archives is very personal for me. I get invited to interview Clarence Thomas. And I thought, how interesting is this? He's not white. I'm not white. We're the two people up here. And actually, now we're like in the Holy of Holies, the National Archives, the C-SPAN audience sort of talking about the meaning of the project. I thought, that's interesting. He's a conservative Republican. I'm a center left Democrat. That's kind of interesting. Who's the we? So for me, I've actually felt kind of, I have a certain freedom because because much of American history is actually a story of black and white. A more full story is early on, Tocqueville talks about black and white, and they would have said red, the Native American experience. So these three races in America: European descendants, African descendants from folks whose ancestors were in Africa, and Native Americans. These three races coming together in what we now call the landmass of the United States. And I thought, look, this is kind of interesting because none of these are my ancestors, actually. I'm not white. I'm actually not black either, but I can identify and do, as a person of color. I'm not Native American, or I'm a different kind of Indian, South Indian, rather than a Native American Indian. So when I say we, I don't mean my ancestors. I'm kind of outside of it. But I consider myself an American. I can choose to be an American. And I can choose to identify with this project, and I do. And so the we ultimately today, it has to be we, the people of the United States, and we've made, and we need to know our history because it's almost the only thing today that actually we have in common. We don't have in America today race, we don't have religion, we don't have even beyond race, ethnicity or language. Some of us, our families came yesterday. Others of us, our families came 300 years ago. Some, our families came, in chains. Others, our families came holding bullwhips. So, my God, and we have to get along. We have to work together. How is that ever going to happen? And we have more challenges than lots of other great democracies in the world that are much more homogeneous. The Norwegians are more homogeneous. The Danes are more homogeneous, or the French or the Germans. So we're a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-linguistic, polyglot society. That's the we today. How do we get along? And here's what I think. We get along in part by taking seriously our laws, our institution, our constitution, and our history. So almost none of these people are my forebears. My parents came to the United States in the mid 20th century. But I'm going to try to tell as honest a story as I can, the good, the bad, and the ugly, about what Americans did right, what they did wrong, over the course of history. I'm going to try to write a saga, kind of like, Alex Haley and Roots. That's an intergenerational saga. Mine's going to be an intergenerational saga too, but it's not going to be about the Haley family, his family going all the way back to Kunta Kinte, and Chicken George and all the rest. It's going to be a story of we, the people of the United States, our constitutional conversation, our traditions. And some people on the left won't love it. Some people on the right won't love it. I'm going to try to be as honest as I can be about what I think the data actually show. And so I told you, the Constitution is actually pro-slavery. The Declaration of Independence, the Revolution, not so much. The Brits actually weren't so good on slavery as some people are saying. Lord Dunmore issued a proclamation, for example, but it didn't actually free all the slaves, only the slaves of the revolutionaries, not the slaves of the loyalists. Actually, Dunmore is, and the Brits are actually doing bad things to various slaves that they capture. They're actually re-enslaving some people. So, history's complicated. I'm going to try to tell a story. And at the end of the day, the we, and it's a pun. The words that made us is also the words that made the U.S. How did South Carolinians and Massachusetts people ever come together to form anything, because they're actually rather different societies. South Carolina is deeply, deeply committed to human inequality, and people like James Otis early on are saying, this is wrong, we should get rid of it. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Lots of questions are coming for the Q&A at this particular point, Tom. I'm going to turn it over to Nat to ask some questions from the audience.
Thank you, Corey.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Corey. The first question we have from the audience comes from Kit, and Kit asks, young people of color often feel that the early American constitutional historical period is not about them and is even opposed to them. Can you speak more on how high school history teachers can be honest about this period's exclusion of people like those students, yet still connect them to the importance of the early republic for our country today?
So one thing that I did say is, you can't, if you're going to do history and you're going to teach history, you have to teach it historically, not anachronistically. So I judge 1787, not by 2022, but by 1786. What happened before? 1776, again, not by today, but what happened before. So my claim is that actually, so it's not just if you study American history, you look at the history of any people anywhere in 1776, and women are not going to be treated equally. And there's actually going to be human bondage. And that's true of Native American societies. You see, there's going to be war and nastiness. So if you're actually historical, here's the question you have to ask. At any given point, are people from, maybe from our perspective, to some extent, how we think about things, are people moving forward or backward? So my belief is that actually, for all its flaws, the American Revolution is moving forward, because actually it's moving toward a system in which people are going to get to decide how they themselves are going to be governed, rather than being governed by an unelected king who just claims power because he was born the right way, an unelected House of Lords that again claims power by dint of birth, and they were being governed by a parliament halfway across the world that they didn't get to vote for. And I feel this somewhat personally. None of these people are my forebears, not the English folks, not the American folks, but I can identify a little bit, because when my parents are born in India, they're being governed by a king that no one voted for halfway across the world, and a parliament that none of them voted for. And Gandhi is going to stage eventually a revolution on the American constitutional model, you see. He's very much influenced by Americans, and Americans in turn are going to learn from him, like MLK. And then in turn, Mandela will build on MLK, and Gandhi, who's building on Thoreau and Jefferson. So here's what I would say about, when you look back in 1776, there are going to be all these exclusions. But that's going to be true almost anywhere in the world. But ask yourself, are they improving things or moving backwards? And I did say, I derive genuine inspiration from the fact that the world's first abolition society, again, in the history of the planet, is formed in the city of brotherly love, Philadelphia, in 1775. And in that very same city, you're going to get actually the Declaration of Independence in 1776. You're going to get the signing of the Constitution in 1787. The Pennsylvania state legislature is going to pass a law gradually abolishing slavery, not freeing individual slaves, ending slavery everywhere in Pennsylvania, 1780. That's an inspiring story. Now, there was one other pointed question. Okay, that may be good for slaves and people of color, but what about their actual agency? What affirmative role are they playing in their own emancipation and liberation? And it is true that some of the stories I tell are stories of prominent white people leading the charge. People like Benjamin Franklin, who at the end of his life actually tries to get Congress to get rid of slavery as fast as possible. Or George Washington, at the end of his life, provides for the freeing of his slaves. And they are the ones who had more power. to do certain things. But in telling the story, their stories, I also try to talk about, the influences. So I have a painting about George Washington and his favorite servant, his manservant, his Brits would call him his valet, or his valet, Billy Lee, African-American, a slave whom he frees before anyone else. And I actually think he had a kind of personal relationship with Billy Lee. And I talk about that just a bit. So I'm trying to, but it is true that when you don't have a lot of power, in a story that's really about legal power. Now, one other thing, I tell stories, for example, about how 10% of the American military are actually African free blacks and newly freed slaves. That's interesting to me. And I show you how in a famous painting by Trumbull, The Battle of Bunker's Hill, if you look carefully, you see a black person in the corner of the screen, and Americans are being told that Prince Esterbrook and other people, black people, are there at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and elsewhere. So that's the most honest answer I can give. But thank you for the question.
We had quite a few questions on the Constitution and Native Americans that I'll try and summarize and lump into one. So these are questions from Ken, from Lois, and from Helen. And Helen in particular asks, what are the constitutional rights given to Indian nations and tribes in the Constitution? And how have these developed and changed over the years? And Ken, perhaps as an addition to asks, with these inclusions to the Constitution, how were these rights ignored and overlooked for so long?
Native American tribes in general are the big losers of the constitutional project. And in part, that's because the constitutional project is very much a national security project, and it's not for the benefit of the Brits. The idea is kick them out, not for the benefit of the Spanish, kick them out, not for the benefit, I'm not defending this, I'm just actually trying to describe it, not for the benefit of the French, who are going to try to be pushed off, or for many of the Native American tribes, because many of these tribes had warred against the United States. I mentioned earlier, I begin with this conflict. The world knows it as the 7 Years' War, but in America it's known as the French and Indian War. And many of the Indian tribes were lying actually against the Brits and the French, the Brits and Americans who at that time were actually on the same side. So the Americans side first with the Brits against the French and various Indian tribes. And then in the American Revolution, the French are helping us, and we're fighting against the Brits, and many Native American tribes are still siding, with the Brits. International diplomacy and politics, it's very brutal, complicated stuff. Okay, we're friends with the Brits, but and against the French, but then we side with the French, but then there's going to be complexities with Napoleon, and we side against this tribe, but maybe later on we try to befriend them. Are we friends with the Soviet Union, Russia, or not, or Ukraine? So Native American tribes are actually not the main beneficiaries of the American Constitution, but here's what they are offered. And I'm going to end this story with actually Andrew Jackson, who was brutal to Native Americans and tribes. And I just have to tell you the truth about all of that. But even Jackson actually is very interesting. He doesn't hate Native Americans at all. What he hates is tribes, because he is a general and they're often fighting against him. So what's offered basically to Native Americans is assimilation. You have to leave your tribes. You're going to have to, as a practical matter, and assimilate into the general project. You can come to Dartmouth. You can, and here's what's, and I didn't know this, Andrew Jackson adopts a Native American orphan, a little Red Creek orphan, as his own son, Lincoya Jackson. He would never do that to a black person. He's very racist when it comes to blacks, but actually he's not that way with Native Americans. He doesn't like tribes, but he likes Native Americans. As late as the 14th Amendment, the words of the 14th Amendment are going to talk about excluding Indians not taxed. Tribal Indians are going to lose out in effect. Abraham Lincoln, you might think he's a great man. I admire him. He fights against Native Americans in the Black Hawk War. As president of the United States, he actually wages war against certain Native American tribes who side with the Confederacy. His own grandfather and namesake, Abraham Lincoln, was actually slain and right in front of his cabin in a border ambush by Native Americans. So Native Americans in the tribes are going to be dispossessed of their property, their lands. They're going to be the big losers of the project, and I don't hide that fact. That's I try to tell it, with honesty. But and if I'm telling anything redemptive, I'm saying, but here's what is being offered. They can eventually, if they want, leave their tribes and become full-blown American citizens. So, we have Irish Americans and Italian Americans, South Asian Americans, Indian Americans, but also Native Americans can just become, can join that assimilative melting pot. But we have tribes today, but they are a shadow of what they once were. They can run casinos and they have little reservations, but they're nothing like what they had in the 1750s, which was a very different world. So now what's being offered to them is join the American project. We have tribes, but the Constitution doesn't protect tribes very strongly, truth be told. And I try to be honest about that.
We had a great many questions about the idea that the American Constitution is a pro-slavery document. And so Jeffrey asks, well, I think a lot of people like to expand on what explicitly in the Constitution leads you to this conclusion. And then also Jeffrey asks, does the Constitution as originally written explicitly endorse the institution of slavery? Or
brilliant questions, Jeffrey. No, it doesn't. They're ashamed of it. Here's an analogy. They're like, many of them, smokers. They know smoking is bad. They'd like to quit, but they're kind of addicted to it. They are not proudly pro-slavery in most of America. Okay, let me take a step back. There's not one thing, even though I talk about us. There's New England, which is very emphatically anti-slavery. They're the middle colonies, which have a lot of anti-slavery folks in them, Quakers, for example, in Pennsylvania. And then there's Virginia, which is torn. And then there's the Deep South, which is emphatically pro-slavery, South Carolina. Why would such different places actually form one indivisible union? Because they had to beat the Brits. Why do I say the Constitution is fundamentally pro-slavery? Because it's complicated. Slavery, there are about 10 different things that we could talk about slavery: international slave trade, interstate slave trade, slavery in the states, slavery in the West, slavery in individual states, fugitive slaves, sojourning slaves, how slavery is counted or not in the House of Representatives, how it's counted or not in the Electoral College, free blacks. There are a bunch of different issues. Here's why I, in the end, unfortunately, think the Constitution is basically pro-slavery in its bones, in its essence. That's why I call myself a neo-Garrisonian. Because, Jeffrey, I'm going to give you a little lesson. If you and I are writing a Constitution together, I will let you, Jeffrey, write every word of the document if you let me write every number. So it turns out that one number in the Constitution ends up being massively powerful. It doesn't say slavery, they're embarrassed by it in all sorts of ways, but they give every slave state extra credit for having slaves. If you have slaves, you get more seats in the House of Representatives and the Electoral College. That's the 3/5 clause. And you might think, yes, it's offensive. Slaves should count fully with as everyone else. 5/5. No, that would be worse, Jeffrey, because slaves aren't voting anywhere. The question isn't whether slaves are voting, but how many seats South Carolina is going to get, slave states are going to get. And anything over 0 means South Carolina gets more seats in the House and the Electoral College, the more people it enslaves, the more people it drags over from Africa in chains and these hellish slave ships. So it's being rewarded for having more slaves. That's a horrible system. And over time, it gets worse and worse and worse because slaves actually breed. They beget more slaves. And so Massachusetts, Virginia, and South Carolina, which began kind of working together, will drift further and further and further apart. And I think the Constitution is basically pro-slavery because 3/5 gives the Southern states a huge advantage in the Electoral College. Every president is basically, before Lincoln, a Southerner who owned slaves or a Northerner who compromises with slavery, including John Quincy Adams. As president, his vice president is John C. Calhoun from South Carolina. John Adams, his father, his running mates were South Carolinians. These guys only become emphatically anti-slavery when they're no longer presidents. So because of 3/5, the presidency is skewed toward the South. Thomas Jefferson would have lost against John Adams. It were just a straight up fair vote among free people. And presidents will pick justices who will write heinous opinions like Dred Scott. So Jeffrey, I'll let you write every word and you can say, well, we won't use the word slavery. Fine. But if you let me write every number and I'm a pro-slavery person and put in 3/5, I'll win that game. So that's why net, I wish it weren't so, but I'm an honest historian. I'm saying it's actually, unfortunately, pro-slavery, and that's going to lead to a civil war. But here's the great thing. Volume 2, I'm going to tell you the epic story about how we moved from being a pro-slavery constitution to an emphatically anti-slavery constitution. The 13th Amendment is immediate, universal, uncompensated emancipation. Wow, wow, wow. And then the 14th Amendment on civil rights for Blacks, and the 15th and women, and the 15th Amendment on political rights for Blacks. Wow, wow, wow. So stay tuned. It started out bad, but it's going to get better in the later volumes of the saga.
The next question, I think, builds on your early conversation with Corey about ordinary Americans and their reactions and engagement with the US Constitution. We talked a bit about how to quantify what ordinary is during this period, given the huge diversity in, region, demographic, legal status, right? To what extent did most Americans actively engage with the Constitution during this period? Gretchen asked about literacy rates, for example, and Joshua asks, was education at all debated during the creation of the Constitution? Was this an elitist document, or was this something that people were actively encouraged to learn about and to interact with?
Brilliant, thank you. Let's start with the first sentence, which is powerful, but you don't even actually, it's so familiar to you, don't actually pause to listen to it. We, the people of the United States, ... do ordain and establish this Constitution. Here's what's epic. They put the thing to a vote up and down the continent. It wasn't 39 people signing their names to a document in Philadelphia or 55 people behind closed doors. They put the thing to a vote up and down the continent. In that vote, more ordinary people were allowed to vote than had ever been allowed to vote on anything in the history of planet Earth. There were very few democracies that exist. Remember, I said you have to think about things historically, not judge them by 2022, but by what happened before. In the history of the planet, there were almost no democracies in the world, in most places and most times. And even the few places that were democratic never put their constitutions to a vote. Athens didn't, the Roman Republic didn't, Britain never did, Switzerland never did. The Declaration of Independence not put to a vote. The in 1776, early state constitutions not put to a vote in 1776. Articles of Confederation 1777 to 81 not put to a vote. Constitutions put to a vote, and what a vote it was. In 8 of the 13 states, the ordinary property qualifications are eliminated or lowered. In 2, there weren't any to begin with. Nowhere are they raised. Here are the rules in New York on voting on the Constitution. Every free adult male citizen can vote. No race test, no religious test, no property qualifications, no literacy test. Now, women aren't voting, but they haven't voted anywhere in the history of the world, and there's still, is slavery there. But if we compare it to what went before, more people, ordinary people, are being allowed to participate than ever before in the history of the planet. And what's the first thing they say? They say, dudes, you forgot the rights. We want rights, which is the elites forgot the rights. Ordinary people insisted on them. And how did they? They read the Constitution, which is short, so ordinary people could read it. It was reprinted in full in 70 newspapers up and down the continent. The literacy rates are very high in America, 90% or more, in part because it's a pretty religious society, pretty Protestant society, and Protestants need to read their Bible. And so actually, even though they didn't go to fancy schools, Abraham Lincoln will have less than a year's total education formal in his life, not college or a grad school, kindergarten through everything, less than 1 year in a school. But my God, he's self-taught, he's literate, and he's an embodiment of this early American. Ordinary people read and write and think and argue, and oh, it's an amazing society for all its exclusions.
I think we have time for one last quick question. And it comes from Teresa. And Teresa asks, with the decline of civic education in schools, how can the approach of your book and the insights of constitutional law help inform a civics education and also a history education at this current time?
So that is, Teresa, the question. Thank you for that. This is a book written basically for high school teachers. It tries to tell because so many myths abound. I'm trying to correct a lot of misunderstandings. I was taught all sorts of things that weren't true, and I'm trying to set the record straight. Realistically, high school students aren't probably going to read this book. It's 600 pages, but high school teachers can. I'm available to people, in summer and elsewhere through places like Gilder Lehrman to talk you through what kind of lesson plans you could devise, using this material. But civics education has not been funded. That, we're teaching to the test, and it's all about STEM, which is important. But without a civics education, we die, and civics education is lapsing. So enter this book that tries to help you think about how you're going to actually teach your kids. And if you want me to do a Zoom session with your students or something like that, email me and let's do it, because this is important. Without that, actually, our civilization dies.
Thank you so much, Akhil, for this conversation and this context, and really ending on this note, which I think is a call to action for us to really think about the ways that as educators, we are stewards. And so as we close, I just wanted to share before folks head out what we have forthcoming. As a reminder, please visit our Gilder Lehrman bookshop at bookshop.org to purchase a copy of this book. It's really important for us and helps to support our programming for history teachers and students. Our next book breaks is a week from today. It's going to be Sunday, 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we are going to be in conversation with Jia-Lin Yang on One Mighty and Irresistible Tide, the epic struggle over American immigration from 1924 to 1965. And then, of course, we have the abundance of resources that are available on the Gilder Lehrman website that you can access, especially primary sources. We have digital exhibitions, information about the Hamilton Education Program, and much more. But on behalf of the Institute, myself, Dr. Amar, I just wanted to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much.